Welcome to Pachehra Talks. My name is Arun and I'm Solutions Architect MCT, currently working with Novin Tech, which is one of the best organizations to work with. Also received many Great Place to Work awards. This is my channel and these are my views. Today in Security Specialist series, we are going to understand Service Endpoint as you see on the screen. Then we are going to explore the security benefits or security perspective of utilizing service endpoints. So let's try to understand the concept first and then dig it further to the various aspects of service endpoints, including service endpoint policies, the concept, the usage, scenarios, a lot of things like that. Okay, so let's get started. So the very first thing, as you see on the screen, this is Azure, and we have created one virtual network on Azure. Inside the virtual network, we have a subnet, and inside the subnet, come on, don't do it. Inside the subnet, we have a simple virtual machine. Okay. Now we have these three app service, Azure Storage, Azure SQL, which are managed services or PaaS services created right here, not inside the virtual network, but outside of it, but in Azure, because these are Azure services which holds public IP addresses. These are PaaS services. You can see when you create the app services, you get the URL which can be easily browsed from anywhere, and you get the URL to deploy your code through FileZilla or any other means. So you can simply access if you're not applying the restrictions and all. The point is, these are the PaaS services, managed services, and they have the public IPs. Service tags, if you remember that we talked about, service tags is the group of the IPs for these services. I have chosen these three. Doesn't mean it's applicable for these three. These are applicable for other PaaS services as well, but these are the services that we already covered in this particular series, so I picked these three services. Right, so these are the three PaaS services outside virtual network. This is the network firewall that we have already talked about during Azure SQL or app services, and even during the other videos that you need to configure. And these services has the combination of IPs, so these are showing those public IPs. What it means, simply it means when somebody from outside try to browse, they will land here on these public IPs, and they can access these PaaS services. Now think about it, somebody is running Azure virtual machine, and this virtual machine wants to access these services. Well, even this will go like this. No, through the public internet. Now traffic is going outside Azure, outside virtual network, in public. Not a good idea, right? Hence the uh, discovery of service endpoint or the innovation of service endpoint, which simply means this traffic will not go like this, but this will go like this from the MS backbone to these services. We can utilize this network firewall to restrict traffic from other sources and utilize only this subnet where this endpoint is enabled. Okay, so this is the basic concept behind this. So we have understood all this part. Now let's try to put this with a simple scenario. Let's consider this VM that we have here, and we already have a service endpoint enabled here, let's suppose. Okay, now We have also configured Azure storage account to allow access to that specific subnet. Okay. Now, when an application on this VM tries to access the storage account right here, how the traffic will flow? Well, this app here will do the DNS query, right? For the storage account URL, right? Now, DNS resolution directs the request to the public IP address of the storage account. Now, instead of sending traffic like this, what will happen? Routing will happen, that you can also check under the effective routes that I have showed you in the NSG. So instead of sending traffic out to the public internet, Azure routes the traffic internally within the Azure network from the VM directly to the storage account through the backbone. So the storage account validates that the incoming traffic is from the allowed subnet and permits the connection. All right, so that's how Service Endpoint helps us. So in summary, while the traffic to an Azure storage account with a Service Endpoint enabled appears to target a public IP based on a DNS resolution, but that's not true. The actual traffic flow is internal to the Azure backbone network, providing a secure and optimized path for the communication. And you can see all that under effective routes. So this is the basic concept of service endpoint. Now it's time to define this concept from the perspective of MS Microsoft documentation and from the perspective of certification. We have understood the concept, we understood how it helps us. So it's time to define everything. So let's start with very first thing. What is service endpoint? Well, service endpoint is a feature within Microsoft Azure that enables secure and direct connectivity between the virtual network and Azure services over the backbone network. Okay, so this connectivity is established without the need to cross over the public internet, enhancing what if it will not go to the public internet, it will enhance the security, and of course reducing the latency as well. Just think about it, moving like this and like this, and that too on the backbone which already has better connectivity, speed, networking, and all. So service endpoints are specifically tied to individual Azure services like PaaS services, managed services that we have mentioned here, and these are scoped to a specific subnet. Yeah, you do not want to enable for the entire virtual network, but only for that subnet that's supposed to talk to these services. For example, you're running VM on this subnet, and that application that is running on this VM needs storage account at the backend to put down maybe some pictures or large files, right? So that's a simple example. All right, so the primary concept behind Azure Service Endpoint is to extend your virtual network's identity to Azure services, allowing these services to recognize the traffic as coming directly from your VNet, like this. Okay, so now I think it is pretty clear what it is and how it helps us. Okay, so now let's see what are the main advantages of utilizing Azure Service Endpoints. The very first is improved security, as we have already understood when we were trying to explain the concept. Improved security. How? Well, because of the direct connectivity. Service endpoints provide a direct connection from virtual network to Azure services over the Azure backbone, right? So, eliminating the need to expose services to the public internet. This reduces the attack surface by ensuring that only traffic from designated virtual networks can access the service. Then, what else? Well, service endpoints allow for more granular access controls by enabling you to restrict access to Azure services based on specific subnets within a virtual network. So we can say a fine grained access control. Again, it is enhancing the security, but we can do that as well to enhance the security. That's the point. All right, then it will, of course, enhance the performance. How? Because traffic to Azure service through service endpoint uses Microsoft or Azure backbone network, which can lead to lower latency and better performance. Then we can also think about one more point, which is it will help to simplify network architecture by reducing the need for custom routes or public IPs, restriction or opening for Azure service accesses. So we can say reduced complexity. Okay. And finally, there is something one more because it is definitely helping us. Definitely, it has a point to use it. But how much? How much somebody has to pay? Well, be happy. You need not to pay because service endpoints are provided at no extra charge, offering an affordable way to secure and optimize access to Azure services. Don't pay for it. Just utilize the service. Okay. All right, what else? Anything that you guys can think of, put it in the comment. Well, when combined with Azure RBAC and network policies, service endpoints offer an integrated approach to managing access permissions. For example, an e-commerce company can use service endpoints along with RBAC to ensure that the only authorized developers can access and modify their Azure functions, thereby enforcing both network level and identity based access controls. It could be a point, right? So yeah, these are our benefits from security perspective or the advantages of using service endpoints. Now there are few consideration we should think for, but first let me put it down in a box and put it somewhere else and call it something like advantages. Okay, now another thing which is considerations before applying or opening these service endpoints. The very first thing is IP address switch. What it is? Well, enabling a service endpoint changes the source IP addresses from public to private. When the subnet communicates with the configured Azure service, this switch may temporarily disrupt existing TCP connections. So it's advisable to plan for this transition during non-critical periods or during the architecture and design before you started running workloads on it. We can take an example to understand it. Let's suppose if an application is performing a critical data upload to Azure Blob Storage and initiate the service endpoint activation post upload to avoid interruption. That would be the consideration. Right, so IP address switch happens. Ideally, whenever you create your architecture and design, these things would be considered then and there. And then you deploy your workloads and work on it without any interruption and issues. Right, so there is one more thing that you can also consider, which is the DNS name for Azure services, because your IP, your DNS names for Azure services continue to resolve to public IP addresses, as I explained in the diagram, even though the actual traffic flows over Azure's internal network. Then these network security groups work seamlessly with service endpoints, but if outbound traffic is denied, outbound internet traffic is denied, specifying service tags in NSG rules can enable traffic to specific Azure services. So DNS and NSGs. Considerations, okay? To make a point, we can definitely create a simple example. For example, a security policy requires blocking all outbound internet traffic from a subnet. By using NSG service tags, outbound connections to Azure storage can still be permitted while enforcing the broader security policy. All right, let me take this to the corner, all right, and put it in a box so that we are aware we did talk about it. Now it's time to, we know service endpoint, we know how to enable it. I will show you on the portal as well. But for now, let's talk about if something happens, means logging and troubleshooting. The very first thing is, after configuring service endpoints for an Azure service, you should validate their effectiveness by examining the source IP address in service diagnostic logs. Yes, with service endpoints enabled, the source IP for request originating from your virtual network should show as the private IP address of the client within your virtual network instead of an Azure public IP address. Okay. The second thing is effective routes. Another method for validation is checking the effective routes for network interface in the subnet. You should see a specific route to the service that has a next hop type of virtual network service endpoint, indicating the traffic to the Azure service is taking a direct path over the Azure network. So these two things can help you logging and troubleshooting. Yeah, service diagnostics and effective routes to check if it's enabled properly. Well, I think we are almost done. There is something else. Let me explain this to you. Now, this is app service. This is the entire service, right? But you only want your app service instance. Okay. Your app service instance, your app service instance to be accessed by only your subnet, because this is the entire app service. Okay. So there is something called service endpoint policies. What is this? Service endpoint policies. Okay, let's try to explain it further. These service endpoint policies are essential, a set of rules applied at the subnet level within a virtual network, which specify which Azure service resource. How would you identify? With the help of resource IDs. So which specify uh, Azure service resources the subnet can communicate with. Okay, so our subnet, and our app service instance, not the entire app service that Microsoft hosted, but our instance, right? That is the point I'm trying to make here. So these policies work in conjunction with service endpoints, extending their capabilities by not just enabling private connection to Azure service, but also tightly controlling which service instance can be accessed. All right, let me show you this. Now, if you go to the virtual network, as you see here, you come under settings and you will see service endpoints. Now, here on the service endpoint, if you add, it will add a service endpoint. Now, these are the services, as you can see. Active Directory, Cosmos, Event Hub. There are so many services. This is the service for entire storage services, right? Microsoft storage. Here we can select our one subnet for which you want to enable the endpoint. My subscription is disabled. It will get reactivated soon. That's the reason I'm not able to perform the lab, but I can tell you it's very simple. Go to service endpoint, click on add service storage account. You want the endpoint. I'm not touching any policies here as of now. If you add, it will create one service endpoint. As right now you can see Microsoft.web. I already have one service endpoint for the app subnet which says succeeded. Okay, now app subnet. Now let me go back to storage account. Okay, now here under networking we have firewalls and network enabled from all networks, enabled from selected virtual networks IP address, right? Microsoft networking routing and internet routing. So it will determine how you would like to route your traffic as it travels from its source to an Azure endpoint. So anyways, this is the firewall that I was talking about. This was highlighted right here, the red one. Anyways, I was trying to show you the endpoint which is there on the Microsoft web, not on the storage account. But I don't have any app services that I could show you. And I cannot even create it. But that is fine. That is still fine. Best way to show you is go to the virtual network, and under virtual network we simply go to service endpoint, and just like this is for the web we have created. We can create one more for the storage or SQL or any other PaaS services. Once the endpoint is created, once this endpoint is created, you need to go to the that particular service. For example, I don't have this, but we can have storage account. We go to that storage account and we block all the access from all networks, only from the selected virtual network. We can click here and select the existing virtual network and the subnet. That's how we can enable the access only for the virtual network or subnet. And here we have service endpoint policies. We can create service endpoint policies from here. See, this is disabled. We cannot create it, but it's not so big. It will just help us to identify the specific instance that we want to enable the connectivity or communication to. Okay, under policy definition, resource aliases, there's nothing big, to be honest. You select the resource group, give it a name, go to policy definition, add a source. Once you hit source, storage, scope, single account, this is disabled, but you can select, you can go inside the resource group, that particular resource you want to enable the endpoint for. So that's how service endpoint policy will help you. Okay, I hope this was helpful. Just to explain it further, let's take this scenario. A company hosts its application on Azure using multiple Azure storage accounts for different environments like development, testing, and production. Okay. They want to ensure that the application components in the development subnet can only access the development storage account and not the production one. So what is the solution? Policies, right? So after enabling the storage service endpoint on the development subnet, the company applies a service endpoint policy that specifies only the development storage account resource ID. That's how they can identify. This ensures that even if a developer mistakenly configures the application to access the production storage account, the network policy prevents this access, thereby protecting sensitive data. We can take another example. Let's suppose an organization uses Azure SQL for its customers, or maybe CRM. It's critical to ensure that only the subnet hosting the CRM application can access the database, preventing any unauthorized access from any other part of the network. So what's the solution? Policies. This enhances the security further. With SQL database service endpoint enabled on the CRM subnet, the organization applies policy, service endpoint policy, to restrict access solely on the CRM system's Azure SQL database instance. This policy reinforces the security posture by narrowing down the potential access points to sensitive customer data. And what I was showing you, we can easily understand. You add a resource, you select resource group and that particular resource. Okay, so this policy will be applicable storage account to this instance to that particular subnet that we have enabled. I hope this was really helpful. We tried to explain the concept, that will really helpful. Then we tried to explain the advantages, the consideration when we apply it, the few things which help us in logging and troubleshooting to understand whether service endpoint is successfully enabled. Then we understood the service endpoint policies which make it more secure or further point one-to-one communication. All right, with this I think we are good, and I hope it was informative.